Driving along the highway, we often see warning signs. To disregard them puts us in real danger of accident and injury. The same is true in the race of life. God has warnings in Scripture we'd better face up to, or face the consequences. Today, get ready for some serious stuff from the book of Hebrews. Stay with us. From Chicago's Moody Church, this is Running to Win with Dr. Erwin Lutzer, whose clear teaching helps us make it across the finish line. Our current series is Highlights from Hebrews, and today we turn again to Hebrews chapter 10. In this, his fifth message, Dr. Lutzer is speaking on taking sin seriously and on what some sinning believers have actually done.
Now notice what the author says about people like that. He says, first of all, he says they have trampled underfoot the blood of the Son of God. Imagine it. Here is the blood about which we have sung, the blood about which I have spoken in previous messages, the blood that is on the mercy seat, the blood by which we can come into God's presence. It is the blood that gives us atonement and access into the presence of a wondrous, holy, majestic God. And now you're stepping on it. You're stepping on it. You don't step on something that is clean and white. You don't step on something like that. You honor it, don't you? And think of the horror of stepping on Christ's blood, wiping your shoes on it. Number two, he says he has regarded the blood of the covenant as common, as an unholy thing. Please catch the contrast. The very blood that made you holy is being regarded as unholy. The very blood that sanctified you is being regarded as being unsanctified and common. Little wonder, the third thing that he says about people like that is that they have insulted the Spirit of grace. The very Spirit that drew them to the Father, without which one cannot come to the Father, Jesus clearly taught. The very Spirit who indwelt them and gave them a sense of conviction so that they saw their need for Christ. That Spirit is insulted because they say, I'm going to do my own thing. Oh, I know that God doesn't want me to do this and this and this. I know that it's His will that I serve Him. But I want to do my very own thing. It's difficult to define this sin because it might have many different aspects. This week I was speaking at a camp actually in New York, and somebody told me the story of a rather famous Christian, I believe him to be a Christian, who is leaving his wife and family because of the pressures of the fame that are upon him and because of the money that's involved. I don't want to tell you too much of the story, but you look at it, and he said, I know I'm doing wrong, but this is what I'm doing. I'll tell you something. This text applies to him. You know that you're doing wrong, and you're going to do it. You are insulting the blood that purchased you. Serious business. Greater responsibility comes to us even than the Old Testament people. Secondly, I want you to notice that there is a greater judgment. Greater judgment. You'll notice it says there is no longer a sacrifice for sins. In other words, you are turning away from the very sacrifice that can restore you to fellowship with God. But what do you get in return? A certain terrifying expectation of judgment and the fury of fire which will consume the adversaries. Now, many people have read that, you see, and the first thing they think of is fire. That means hell. Not necessarily. You know that in the Old Testament, God sometimes judged His own people with fire. They were redeemed by the blood of the Lamb. They came out of Egypt. They were redeemed. And many of the people who died in the wilderness in unbelief, I believe, died and went to heaven because they were God's people. They had been redeemed, but they didn't look redeemed. And God disciplined them even to the point of death. And sometimes fire came down and actually consumed them. And that's the imagery that the author of the book of Hebrews is using. But I believe that it is a temporal, this world fire, and not the fires of hell. So the question you have in your mind then is, what then is this terrifying expectation of judgment that could even be worse maybe than actually being put to death? Well, I want you to know today that there are people today living in rebellion against God who are in far worse shape emotionally and spiritually, people to whom death would be a welcome exit from their misery because the hand of God, the rod of God is on them. How does God do it? First of all, you have, of course, guilt. You grieve the Spirit. You know that you're doing wrong. I mean, that's clear. It's sin with a high hand. It is sin with defiance against God. And you just say, I don't care what God says. I'm doing my own thing. Boy, that is serious. And you know what happens? The Spirit of God convicts you and you feel the tug of conscience and you know you shouldn't do it, but you persist in it and you become very, very hard and you steel yourself and you begin to rationalize, and pretty soon the guilt turns into anger and hardness of heart. I have yet to meet somebody who has lived in defiance of God who is not fundamentally angry, either at others or at God. God begins with guilt. The next stage is the intensification of sin's power. The intensification of sin's power. Jesus said, whoever you give yourself to obey, he will become your master and you will become your servant. You look at the Old Testament and what you find is that the nation Israel was always brought under the subjection of some nation whenever they began to defy God, and usually it was a nation whose gods they began to accept. You know, God says, I'm going to bring you into slavery. That's what the whole book of Judges is about, is a cycle of slavery because of disobedience. I find this to be a scandal beyond irony. That people today who are slaves of sin